Welcome back to Advice for Grad Students, or what I wish I knew when I was a first or second year grad student. I'm your host, Phil Haun. I'm an alum of the MIT SSP program, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Josh Rovner, a fellow grad and associate professor at American University. And first, a disclaimer that the views expressed by us today are our own and not from our institution. Josh, welcome to Advice to Grad Students.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Phil.
All right. You picked for today's topic, prepping for general exams. So can you give us a little bit insight of why you wanted to talk about this topic?
I think it's interesting just because I've seen it from both sides. Obviously I sat generals at MIT, and now I'm on the other side of that equation. I have my own PhD students who go through it, and when I saw your list of possible topics, I thought it might be interesting to think back on, try to remember what it was like when I did mine, 20 years ago now, and what I see from my own students today and how they experience it and what they do well and what I think helps them succeed.
Okay, well, let's go in and get into it. So what advice would you give, particularly at first or second year grad students as they're looking at those general exams?
So the first and most important piece of advice I would give is don't isolate yourself. Right? Don't look at general exams and say, I've got to find a quiet place and be by myself for months and do nothing but think about this exam. I find this really problematic. It's not I think a healthy way or an effective way to go about the process of getting ready for this exam. Like musicians have this term called woodshedding. I don't know if you know this term. Like the idea is that when you're learning an instrument or you're learning a new style, you take your instrument and your music and you go out to the woodshed and you close the door and you don't come out until you've got it, right? And you really learn your craft by like force of will in an isolated place. And I think that's probably good for like jazz guitar, but it's lousy for generals. Just you're going to have a ton of time in your career to be alone, and this is not one of those times, right? General exams are a time in which you really do need to help each other, right? Study together, work on past general exam questions together, right? Benefit from each other's comparative advantages and comparative expertise, right? And set up a study group simply as a forcing function. Right. When I was in grad school, we had a study group for generals, and we each picked past general exam questions, and we'd say, hey, on the following date, I'm going to prepare an answer for this question, right? And I'm going to write a sample essay, and I'm going to try to brief it to you as a practice exercise. And you force yourself to learn the material, to do the work, to think through it. And you put a deadline on that. By actually having a group, you have to be there for your colleagues just like they have to be there for you. So treat general exams as very much a team sport. Unlike a lot of academia where it is solitary very often, I don't think this is one of those cases. So develop your core cohort, be a good colleague, and help each other through it. That's the first sort of big piece of advice on that. A couple of other sort of practical tips. One, summarize everything you read, right? As you go along, as you're in your normal coursework and you're reading through the syllabus, make sure you have a running file of article and book abstracts that you do. Don't just copy the abstract from the article, read it and write it again in your own words. Right? It's really important to build that kind of file, which will help you study, which will help commit all of these different ideas and arguments to memory. And remember that the articles that are on the syllabus are there for a reason, right? I never assign anything to my PhD students that I wouldn't think about asking them about at generals. Right? And I'm guessing it's the same at MIT today. So, as you're reading for your normal coursework, remember this stuff is also going to be on generals later. So, really work on committing all of those things to memory, writing them down, keeping a working file going. Back in the day, I don't know if this is still the case, but we used to have these big binders that graduate students would circulate with past synopses and different people's notes on key books, and I found it very useful, right? And in our study group, we would use this and try to add to it. I don't know if such a thing still exists, if there's still a hard copy floating around, or if it's been digitized in some way, but it was a good thing. So add to it and then hopefully use it yourself. The third thing I'll say is ask your faculty what they want in a good general examination. Right? This is something that I wish I had done as a grad student. I thought it wasn't allowed. Right? I thought you can't possibly ask your examiners what constitutes a good essay or what constitutes a successful oral defense. Right? But ask them. Right? They'll probably tell you what they're looking for. Right? So I have my own list of things that I'm looking for in a good general. I want the student to demonstrate understanding of the field, mastery of certain areas that he or she is focused on. I want the student to be able to see dialogue between different scholars and situate works in sort of a broader field. And I want my students to be able to tell me why this matters for policy. Right? That's my list of things that I want from them. I also want them to write clearly, and speak clearly. And I tell them this, right? But at the time, 20 years ago, I was too scared to ask. Don't be. The worst that happens is they just don't tell you. They might be cagey about it, but that's fine. I think they'll mostly be pretty open about what it is they're looking for. The last big piece of advice, which is really simplistic but important, is practice. Right? Generals are hard. Right? I mean, you're sitting in a room all day. I don't know if it's the same format now, but writing 3 big essays for an extended period of time, that's not easy to do. Right? It's taxing. It's physically taxing. It's mentally taxing if you've never done something like that before. Just extended, focused, concentrated writing. So don't let exam day be the first time you've ever done something like that, right? Practice. In my PhD field seminar, this is one of the exercises that I have them do, right? One of their graded exercises is a 4-hour general's essay, right? And they hate it, and it's good practice. You don't want this to be the first time. So, practice the writing if you can. And practice the orals if possible within a study group. Like have people push you on certain things, and see if you can explain concepts clearly out loud that you think you have mastered, but you haven't said them out loud yet. And so practice. Okay.
Yeah, so I wanted to, with the time we have left, I want to focus on that last thing, because most graduate students have had a ton of written exams before. They're familiar with that, at least that concept. But the oral exam, oh my goodness, face-to-face with multiple faculty. What advice would you give grad students about approaching that oral exam?
Well, 2 things. The first is, again, ask your examiners, right? And see if you can get a sense from them of what it is they're looking for, what is a good experience, what's a bad experience. They might tell you, they might not. But the more you can sort of arm yourself with some advanced knowledge, the better, right? And the second thing that I would suggest is take your time when you're thinking of answers, right? It's not a race. It's not, at least in my experience, it's not a time where you're just regurgitating out a bunch of things that you've read. Right? From an examiner's point of view, when I'm doing this, I like to have a conversation. I want to see if we can talk about IR. I want to see if we can talk about security studies. Right? I don't want to sit passively and listen to somebody, read me his working abstracts of a bunch of articles. So to the extent that you can practice that kind of exchange in a group, do it. And the last, I'm sorry, one other thing. If your examiners start to beat you up during orals, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Right? In my experience, the way they handled it was, if I was doing okay and I was answering and giving reasonable responses to their questions, they would quickly move on, right? And when I stumbled, when I struggled over something, well, then they would push harder, right? And at the time, I thought, oh my God, I'm failing. I'm on fire here. This is bad news. Afterwards, they said, no, we just wanted to see how far we could push, right? And how deep you could go, right? So take your time, be thoughtful. Don't worry if you have a stumble along the way.
All right. Well, the last thing I have to say is, Josh, I was a couple years behind you, and I'm really disappointed you didn't share that advice with us before we hit our generals exams. But anyway, thanks for sharing it now, and thanks for spending time with us.
Yeah.
You got one last thing? Anyway.
What I was going to say, I mean, a lot of this stuff, it makes more sense now after you actually sit on the other side of the desk than it did at the time.
Agreed. Well, anyway, thanks
Phil.
for sharing advice today for advice for grad students. All right, take care.